We are tracing the argument through the letter of 1 Timothy, and we are starting in chapter 5. So without further ado, let's dive into 1 Timothy 5, verses 1 and 2. We have a very short passage today, but it forms part of the total passage that is chapters 5 and 6 of 1 Timothy. In this section, essentially Paul gives instructions to Timothy about how he as a pastor should deal with 7 different groups of people in the church. So it's a kind of pastoral household code. The first group, which we'll look at today, is ordinary church members. Then in the rest of chapter 5, he talks about widows, a particular context. Then about elders, about slaves, about the false teachers themselves, about Timothy himself, how to be the man of God that he should be in the context, and finally, some counsel to the rich. So today we are over here, we are looking at Paul's instructions to Timothy about how to deal with church members. Passage is very short, it's just 2 verses, and really it consists of 4 exhortations. So we've got 4 exhortations, and they are to 4 different people, 4 different groups. The first is an older man, then there is to younger men, then to older women, and finally to younger women. And so Paul is telling Timothy how he, as a fairly young pastor in this church, is to relate to different demographic groups within the congregation, and he's giving him some instructions about that. Since the passage is very simple and straightforward, I'm going to unpack it in a single diagram. So we start with the first exhortation, which is to an older man. How is Timothy to deal with older men? Well, there's a double command. There's a negative, do not rebuke. So don't rebuke an older man. And then a positive, but rather encourage him. So Timothy, as a young man, is to address older men in a way that is appropriate, particularly within their cultural setting. That means he is not to rebuke older men, but he is to encourage them. And then there's a manner proposition. So you'll see for each of these instructions, there's a manner proposition represented by the as you would encourage a father. So Timothy, you treat older men in your congregation as fathers. Treat them with the same respect due a father. Second, he talks about younger men, and you'll see the family analogy carrying through. How does Timothy relate to younger men? As, that's our manner, and the family connection, as brothers. Next, older women. He is to relate to older women. Again, the manner is as mothers. And lastly, the one group that's missing, he is to relate to younger women. Younger women, normal thing, we've got our manner proposition as sisters. And then he makes one additional comment on this, treating them as sisters. The generic idea is treat them as sisters. Specifically, that means with all or complete or absolute purity. Now, something to point out just about this passage as we wrap it up. The focus in this passage falls on the first and last elements. So you notice both yeah and yeah, the first and last groups get more detailed instruction than the others. There's specific instructions about older men that are elaborated, don't rebuke but encourage, and specific instructions about younger women where Timothy's relationship is to be one of complete purity. So that's where Paul's stress falls on how Timothy treats older men and younger women. And that in a nutshell is the structure of 1 Timothy 5 verses 1 to 2, the first of 7 groups that Paul is going to teach Timothy how to handle in the church that he's leading. Next, we'll look at Paul's instructions about how Timothy should relate to widows.